At 6:32 in the morning on April 21st, 1944, Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell stood beside a P-51 Mustang at Debden Airfield in England, watching his pilot walk toward an aircraft that had a single point of failure he could not fix. The pilot was Lieutenant James Parker, 22 years old, 14 combat missions, 3 confirmed kills. The German defences had just moved 94 88mm flak batteries around Berlin. Parker would be flying straight into them on a bomber escort mission to Parchim. Mitchell had been maintaining P-51 Mustangs for 7 months. He knew the aircraft inside and out. Single-engine fighter, laminar flow wing, fast at all altitudes, range of over 1,600 miles with drop tanks. The Mustang was the best escort fighter in the world. But the P-51 had one fatal vulnerability that was killing American pilots every single week. It had a liquid-cooled engine. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine ran on a coolant system filled with ethylene glycol, a mixture that circulated through the engine block, through brass tubes in the cylinder heads, into a header tank behind the propeller, then down through exposed lines to a radiator mounted in the belly of the aircraft. The entire system held approximately 17 gallons of coolant. One bullet anywhere in that system meant the engine would overheat within 3 to 7 minutes. 3 to 7 minutes before the engine seized. 3 to 7 minutes before the pilot had to find somewhere to land or bail out over enemy territory. American doctrine said P-51 pilots should stay at altitude, avoid ground fire, focus on fighter escort duty, use speed, use altitude. Never go low where small arms could reach you. Parker had tried that doctrine 13 times. It had not stopped him from getting hit. The 8th Air Force had lost over 500 P-51s in the past 6 months. Most were not shot down by German fighters. Most were brought down by ground fire, by flak fragments, by rifle rounds that punched through aluminum skin and severed a coolant line. Mitchell had watched too many pilots limp back to base with white glycol vapor streaming from their aircraft, engines running hotter and hotter, temperatures climbing past 100 degrees Celsius toward the maximum of 110. Some made it back, most did not. The training manual said the problem was tactical error. The instructors said these pilots were not following doctrine, but Mitchell knew better. The problem was not the pilots. It was the cooling system. The P-51 Mustang cooling system was elegant. It was efficient. It used the Meredith effect to recover some of the drag penalty from the radiator, but it was vulnerable. Every coolant line ran exposed through the aircraft structure. The header tank sat directly behind the propeller with thin aluminum walls. The radiator hung in the belly intake where it was exposed to anything coming from below. A single .30 caliber bullet could puncture any of these components. A single piece of shrapnel from an 88mm shell could tear through a coolant line. Once the system started leaking, there was no backup, no reserve tank, no way to seal the leak in flight. The coolant would stream out through the hole, the temperature would climb, and the pilot would have minutes to decide whether to try reaching friendly territory or to bail out where he was. Mitchell had mentioned this to the engineering officer 4 months ago. The officer said the cooling system met all specifications. North American Aviation had designed it. Packard had built the Merlin engines. Everything was within tolerances. Changing the design would require re-engineering the entire aircraft. That required approval from Wright Field in Ohio, and Wright Field was 4,000 miles away. Modifications would take months, maybe years. The pilots did not have months, so Mitchell did what he could. He checked every coolant connection before every flight. He torqued every hose clamp to specification. He pressure tested the header tank. He looked for cracks, for corrosion, for any sign of weakness in the system. But he could not armor the lines. He could not add redundancy. He could not fix the fundamental vulnerability that every P-51 carried into combat. The first pilot Mitchell lost to cooling system failure was Second Lieutenant David Chen on March 19, 1944. Chen had been in theatre for 4 weeks. Mitchell had worked on his aircraft every morning. They talked about California. Chen was from San Francisco. Mitchell was from Los Angeles. They had both worked on cars before the war. Chen took off at 06:45 on a fighter sweep over France. He came back 3 hours later with his engine temperature gauge showing 108 degrees Celsius and a trail of white vapor behind his aircraft. Chen said he had been hit by ground fire during a strafing pass on a German airfield near Beauvais. Single round, small caliber, punched through the belly skin and clipped a coolant line to the radiator. Chen felt the engine temperature start climbing immediately. He broke off the attack, started climbing, pointed the nose toward England. The engine held together for 18 minutes. 18 minutes of watching the temperature gauge climb, watching the vapor trail grow thicker, knowing the engine was dying. Chen made it across the channel. He made it to the English coast. He made it within sight of Debden. The engine seized 4 miles from the runway. Chen tried to glide in. He almost made it. The Mustang came down in a field 3 miles short, flipped on its back, broke apart. Chen died in the crash. The official report said pilot error. Should have bailed out over the channel when the engine was hit. Should not have tried to bring the aircraft back. Mitchell read the report and knew it was wrong. Chen had done exactly what any pilot would do. He had tried to save his aircraft and get home. The cooling system had killed him anyway. The second pilot was First Lieutenant William Morrison. Morrison was a flight leader, experienced, with 9 kills and 28 missions. He knew the P-51, inside and out. He knew its strengths and its vulnerabilities. He flew smart. On April 7, 1944, Morrison's flight was providing close escort to B-17s over Brunswick. They encountered heavy flak at 22,000 feet. Morrison's aircraft took a hit from an 88mm shell. The shell did not penetrate the cockpit. It did not hit the fuel tanks. It burst 20 feet to the left of Morrison's aircraft and sent shrapnel through the left side of the fuselage. One piece, maybe 3 inches long, cut through the aluminum skin and severed the coolant line running from the header tank to the radiator. Morrison called it out on the radio immediately. Coolant leak, temperature climbing. He stayed with the bombers for another 6 minutes while they completed their bombing run, keeping the German fighters off them even as his engine temperature passed 100 degrees. Then he broke off, dropped out of formation, headed west. Morrison's wingman stayed with him. They crossed into friendly airspace over Holland. Morrison's engine was running at 112 degrees, past maximum permissible temperature. The cylinder heads were starting to warp. Morrison tried to nurse it, reduced power to minimum, kept the nose down to maximize airspeed and cooling airflow. The engine seized over the Zuiderzee at 8,000 feet. Morrison tried to restart it. Would not turn over. He set up for a forced landing on a beach on the Dutch coast. He almost made it. The Mustang hit hard, the landing gear collapsed, and the aircraft cartwheeled. Morrison died on impact. Morrison's crew chief was a friend of Mitchell's, a guy named Rodriguez from Texas. Rodriguez was convinced the cooling system was the weak point. He pulled the maintenance records for every P-51 lost in the previous 3 months. 42 aircraft. 27 had been lost to cooling system failures after battle damage. 27 pilots killed because a single hit had knocked out the entire cooling system. The official reports blamed tactics. Said the pilots should have stayed higher, avoided ground fire, followed doctrine. But Rodriguez showed Mitchell the combat reports. Most of these pilots had been following doctrine. They had been at altitude. They had been escorting bombers. The flak had reached them anyway. The ground fire had found them anyway. 1 bullet, 1 piece of shrapnel, and the cooling system failed. By mid-April, Mitchell had watched 11 pilots from his squadron die. Some he knew well, most he had only met briefly during pre-flight checks, but he had worked on all their aircraft. He had signed off their maintenance logs. He had checked their coolant levels, tested their radiators, torqued their hose clamps. He had done everything by the book. And they had died anyway. The sound of an engine seizing carried across an airfield. A sudden silence where there should be the roar of a Merlin at full power. Mitchell had heard it 4 times. Twice the pilots made it back and crash-landed. Twice the pilots bailed out and were never seen again. Every morning Mitchell worked in the maintenance area. The smell of ethylene glycol and hot metal filled the air. That smell meant coolant was flowing, engines were running, aircraft were preparing for combat. Some of those aircraft would come back. Some would come back trailing vapor. Some would not come back at all. And Mitchell would be there the next morning, smelling the same smells, checking the same systems, signing off the same maintenance forms, watching more pilots walk out to aircraft that could be killed by a single bullet. On the evening of April 20th, 1944, Parker came to the maintenance area and found Mitchell working on his assigned P-51. Parker asked if there was anything Mitchell could do to protect the coolant system, anything at all. Parker said he knew the risks. He had seen Morrison go down. He had seen Chen crash. He did not want to die because a stray round hit a coolant line. Mitchell looked at Parker, saw the fear, saw the desperation, saw a kid who knew he was vulnerable every time he went low, every time he flew through flak, every time he came within range of ground fire. Mitchell told Parker there was nothing he could do. The cooling system was what it was. The lines ran where they ran. The radiator sat where it Saturday. He could check everything, test everything, make sure there were no leaks, but he could not armor the system. He could not make it bulletproof. Parker said he understood. Then he asked if Mitchell could at least double clamp all the coolant connections, just in case vibration loosened something. Mitchell said he would do it that night. Mitchell worked alone after 2,200 hours. The maintenance hangar was quiet. Most of the crew had gone to sleep. The only sounds were the distant rumble of generators and the buzz of insects against the overhead lights. He pulled the cowling panels off Parker's P-51 and inspected every coolant connection. The header tank connections, the radiator inlet and outlet, the cylinder head manifolds. Every connection had a hose clamp. Mitchell added a second clamp to each one, positioned 90 degrees from the first for redundancy. It was not much. It would not stop a bullet. But if vibration loosened a clamp, if a connection started to weep, the second clamp might hold long enough to get the pilot home. The work took 3 hours. His hands were covered in glycol by the time he finished. His back ached from bending over the engine. But every connection had double clamps now. Every joint had redundancy. Mitchell replaced the cowling panels, cleaned his tools, and walked out of the hangar at 01:15. The night air was cold and damp. Somewhere in the distance he heard the sound of engines. RAF bombers heading out for a night raid, probably. The sound made his stomach clench. In 6 hours Parker would take off. In 7 hours Parker would be over Germany. And there was nothing Mitchell could do to protect him from the single bullet that could bring him down. Parker took off at 06:52. Mitchell stood on the flight line and watched the P-51 climb into the morning sky. 16 aircraft formed up and headed southeast toward Germany. Mitchell walked back to the maintenance shack and waited. The mission lasted 4 hours and 37 minutes. Mitchell heard the engines before he saw the aircraft. The formation came back at 11:29. 15 aircraft, 1 missing. Mitchell counted them as they peeled off to land. He did not see Parker's tail number. The flight, leader landed first, then the others. Mitchell walked out to the hard stand where Parker's aircraft should have been. It was empty. The operations officer came by an hour later. Parker had been hit by flak over the target. The formation had seen his aircraft start trailing vapor. Parker had called it out. Coolant hit. Temperature rising. He had stayed with the bombers for another 10 minutes, covering them through the target area, while his engine temperature climbed past 100 degrees. Then he had broken off, headed west, trying to make it back to friendly territory. The last anyone saw of him, he was losing altitude over western Germany, vapor trail stretching behind him, engine temperature past 110 degrees. Parker did not bail out. Parker did not crash. Parker just disappeared. Maybe he landed in a field. Maybe the engine held together long enough to get him down. Maybe he was a prisoner of war now. Or maybe the engine had seized at 5,000 feet. and Parker had gone in hard with no time to get out. They would not know for months. Maybe not until the war ended. That evening, Rodriguez came to Mitchell's work area. He had heard about Parker. He had heard about 6 other P-51s lost that week to cooling system hits, 3 pilots dead, 2 missing, 1 badly injured in a crash landing. Rodriguez said something had to change. Mitchell asked what could change. The P-51 was what it was. The cooling system could not be redesigned in the field. They could not add armor without approval from Wright Field. They could not modify the aircraft without authorization. Rodriguez said that was the problem right there. The system was not built to fix problems. It was built to follow regulations. And while they followed regulations, pilots died. But then something shifted in the way the 8th Air Force flew missions. In late April 1944, Major General James Doolittle made a decision that changed everything. He freed the fighters from a close bomber escort. Instead of staying tight to the bombers, P-51 pilots could range ahead, sweep for German fighters, attack airfields, destroy aircraft on the ground. It was aggressive. It was risky. And it meant P-51 pilots would be going low, strafing targets, exposing themselves to ground fire. The exact situation where the cooling system vulnerability was most dangerous. The new mission profiles were called fighter sweeps. Then they were called Chattanooga missions when they focused on railroads and locomotives. P-51 pilots loved the freedom. They could hunt. They could attack. They could take the fight to the Germans instead of waiting to be attacked. But the losses went up immediately. In May 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 93 P-51s. 41% of those losses were from strafing missions, ground fire, small arms, light flak, coolant systems punctured, engines seizing, pilots going down. The statistics were brutal. A P-51 pilot had better odds in a dogfight with a Messerschmitt 109 than in a strafing pass over a German airfield. The Luftwaffe could be outmaneuvered. Ground fire could not. Lieutenant Robert Hayes was one of the pilots flying these new missions. He had survived Parker's loss. He had survived Morrison's loss. He had flown 26 missions and had 5 kills. On May 19, 1944, Hayes was part of a fighter sweep over northeastern France. His flight found a German supply convoy on a road near Reims. 6 trucks, 2 staff cars, visible from 4,000 feet. Hayes and his wingman rolled in for a strafing pass. Hayes opened fire at 800 yards. His .50 caliber rounds walked across the road, hit the lead truck, set it on fire. He pulled up at 200 feet, started to climb. He felt the hit before he heard it. A sharp bang under his left foot, like someone had kicked the floor of the cockpit. The engine temperature gauge jumped 5 degrees immediately. Then 10. Then 15. Hayes keyed his radio. Took a hit. Coolant system. Temperature climbing. He levelled off at 4,000 feet and pointed the nose west toward England. The vapour trail started 30 seconds later. White glycol mist streaming from under the cowling, visible to everyone in the formation. Hayes watched the temperature gauge. 100 degrees. 102. 104. He reduced power to minimum cruise. The temperature stopped climbing at 106 degrees. Hayes did the math in his head. He was 180 miles from Debden. At minimum cruise speed, that was 40 minutes of flying. The engine manual said maximum continuous temperature was 110 degrees. He was at 106. 4 degrees of margin. 40 minutes to make it home. He could do this. The temperature held at 106 for 8 minutes. Then it started climbing again. 107. 108. Hayes pushed the nose down. Slightly, let airspeed build to increase cooling airflow through the radiator. The temperature stabilized at 108. 30 minutes to England. 2 degrees of margin. Hayes's wingman stayed with him, flying close formation, watching the vapour trail grow thicker. At 110 miles from Debden, the temperature hit 110 degrees, maximum permissible. Hayes held the power steady. If the temperature climbed any higher, the cylinder heads would start warping. Valves would stick, pistons would seize. He would have seconds of warning before the engine locked up. 70 miles from Debden, the temperature hit 112 degrees, past maximum. Hayes could hear the engine running rough. Slight vibration in the stick. Cylinder heads were warping. He was running out of time. 50 miles from Debden, the vapor trail turned grey, burning coolant now, not just evaporating. Temperature at 114 degrees. Engine would seize any second. Hayes called the tower, emergency landing. Straight in approach. No time for pattern. He could see the airfield ahead. 20 miles, 10 miles, 5 miles. The engine was hammering now, loud enough to hear over the slipstream. Temperature gauge pegged at 116 degrees. 3 miles from the runway, the propeller stopped turning. Engine seized. Sudden silence except for the wind. Hayes pitched for best glide speed, 140 miles per hour. He had altitude, he had airspeed. He could make it. He glided over the airfield boundary at 200 feet, dropped the landing gear, touched down halfway down the runway, rolled to a stop. The engine was silent. Steam and glycol vapor poured from the cowling. Hayes shut down the electrical system, unstrapped, and climbed out. His hands were shaking. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. He had made it. But he had been 18 minutes from dying because a single rifle round had punctured a coolant line. Mitchell met Hayes at the aircraft 15 minutes later. Hayes showed him the entry hole. It was under the left side of the fuselage, just aft of the wing root, small, maybe .30 caliber. The bullet had punched through the aluminum skin, passed through the fuselage structure, and clipped the coolant return line from the radiator. Not a direct hit, just a nick, enough to open a hole the size of a pencil lead, enough to drain 17 gallons of coolant in 18 minutes. Mitchell looked at the engine. The cylinder head on the number 3 cylinder had cracked. The valve seats on cylinders 4 and 5 had separated. The pistons were scored. The engine was scrap. Hayes had brought the aircraft back, but the Merlin was destroyed. Rodriguez helped Mitchell remove the engine that evening. They worked under portable lights, unbolting the engine mounts, disconnecting the coolant lines, lowering the Merlin onto a stand. The header tank was empty. The radiator was empty. Every drop of coolant had streamed out through Prosind, that pencil-sized hole. Rodriguez said this was the 14th cooling system loss he had seen in 6 weeks. 14 aircraft damaged or destroyed. 8 pilots dead, 3 missing, 3 injured. All because of hits to the cooling system. He said they needed to do something. Anything. Mitchell said there was nothing to do. They could not armor the coolant lines. They could not add a backup system. The P-51 was a brilliant aircraft with a fatal flaw, and that flaw was engineered into every part of its design. The cooling system itself was a marvel of engineering. 2 separate systems in one radiator assembly. The primary system cooled the engine itself, holding 16.5 gallons of coolant at 30 pounds per square inch of pressure. The aftercooling system handled the supercharger charge, holding 5 gallons at 20 pounds per square inch. Both used a mixture of ethylene glycol and water. 30% glycol, 70% water in normal conditions. The ethylene glycol raised the boiling point high enough that the coolant could run at temperatures up to 110 degrees Celsius without boiling. That was the limit. Above 110 degrees, cylinder heads began to warp, valves began to stick, seals began to fail. The engine would destroy itself. Mitchell had seen it happen a dozen times. Pilots who pushed past 110 degrees thinking they could make it home. The engine would run for a few more minutes, then seize without warning. Every mechanic knew the temperature limits. Every pilot knew them, but knowing the limits did not help when the coolant was streaming out through a bullet hole. You could reduce power all you wanted. You could open the radiator flap to maximum. If the coolant was gone, the engine would overheat. There was no way around it. The system had no reserve, no backup tank, no emergency coolant supply. Once you started losing coolant, you had minutes. 3 minutes if you were unlucky. 7, minutes if you were lucky. The size of the hole determined how fast you lost coolant. A large hole from a 20mm shell would drain the system in 2 minutes. A small hole from a rifle round might take 8 minutes. But the result was always the same. The temperature would climb, the engine would seize, and the pilot would have to put the aircraft down wherever he was. Rodriguez said other aircraft had liquid-cooled engines. The P-38 Lightning had liquid-cooled engines. Why was the P-51 more vulnerable? Mitchell explained it. The P-38 had twin engines. If one cooling system failed, the pilot could shut down that engine and fly home on the other. Redundancy. The P-51 had one engine. If that cooling system failed, there was no backup. The P-38's radiators were mounted in the booms, protected by structure. The P-51's radiator hung in the belly intake, exposed to fire from below. The P-38's coolant lines ran inside the booms. The P-51's lines ran through open fuselage bays. Every design choice that made the P-51 fast and efficient also made it vulnerable. You could not have one without the other. The Packard Merlin engine that powered the P-51 was a masterpiece. 12 cylinders arranged in a V configuration. 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger. At 30,000 feet, it could still produce over 1,200 horsepower. The supercharger compressed the thin air at altitude, forcing more oxygen into the cylinders, maintaining power where other engines failed. But that supercharger generated enormous heat. The compressed air coming out of the second stage could be 200 degrees Celsius hotter than when it entered. That heat had to be removed before the mixture entered the cylinders, or it would detonate and destroy the engine. The intercooler system handled that job. Coolant circulated through passages in the supercharger housing, absorbing the heat from the compressed air, then flowing to the radiator where the heat was dumped into the airstream. Without the intercooler, the engine would last maybe 30 seconds at full power before detonating. The entire cooling system was integrated. The engine coolant system and the intercooler system shared the same radiator, but in separate compartments. The oil cooling system had its own radiator mounted ahead of the main radiator. All three systems depended on airflow through the belly scoop. If anything disrupted that airflow, all three systems lost cooling capacity. A damaged radiator door could cause all three systems to overheat. A clogged radiator from debris could kill cooling across the board. And a bullet through any of the three radiators could lead to system failure. Pilots learned to monitor 3 gauges constantly: engine coolant temperature, oil temperature, intercooler temperature. Normal range for coolant was 80 to 90 degrees Celsius. Maximum continuous was 110 degrees. Anything above that was emergency. Oil should run between 70 and 80 degrees Celsius. Above 100 degrees, the oil would break down and lose its lubricating properties. The engine would seize from oil failure before it seized from overheating. Intercooler temperature should stay below 60 degrees Celsius. If it climbed above 80, the compressed air mixture would be too hot, and detonation would destroy the engine from the inside. 3 systems, 3 temperature gauges. 3 ways the aircraft could be killed by a single bullet. Pilots learned to recognize the signs of cooling system damage immediately. A sudden spike in temperature. A trail of white vapor visible from the cockpit. The smell of glycol vapor seeping into the cockpit through the air vents. That smell was distinctive. Sweet, like antifreeze. If you smelled it in the cockpit, you knew you were losing coolant, and you knew you had minutes to decide what to do. But pilots were starting to notice something. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt could take ground fire that would kill a Mustang. The P-47 had an air-cooled radial engine. No coolant, no radiator, no vulnerable lines. A P-47 could take multiple hits in the engine, cowling, and keep flying. Cylinders could be shot off the radial engine, and the remaining cylinders would keep the aircraft in the air. There was no single point of failure. Mitchell had seen P-47s come back with cylinder heads blown off, oil streaming from broken lines, entire sections of the cowling missing. The pilots would land, shut down, and walk away. The engines looked like they had been through a meat grinder, but they had kept running. One P-47 came back from a strafing mission with 3 cylinders completely destroyed by ground fire. The pilot said the engine ran rough, but it ran. He had flown 80 miles back to base on an engine that was missing a quarter of its cylinders, a P-51. With that kind of damage would have been on the ground in minutes. The P-47 was heavier. It was less maneuverable at altitude. It had shorter range before drop tanks were added. Its rate of climb was not as good. But it could survive ground fire that would doom a Mustang. Mitchell watched a P-47 land one afternoon with over 40 bullet holes in the cowling and wings. The pilot climbed out, looked at the damage, and shrugged. Said he had been hit by ground fire during a strafing pass. The engine had kept running perfectly. No temperature issues. No loss of power. Just some holes in the metal. The crew chief counted the holes. 43. 6 of them had hit the engine directly. The cylinders were dented. One cooling fin was broken. The engine ran perfectly. Mitchell showed the damage to Rodriguez. Rodriguez said that was the difference between air-cooled and liquid-cooled. Air-cooled engines were tougher, more forgiving. You could damage them, and they would keep running. Liquid, cooled engines were more efficient, more powerful for their weight, but they were fragile. One hit in the wrong place, and they were finished. The pilots noticed. The ground crews noticed. By June 1944, when the 8th Air Force assigned ground attack missions, they preferentially tasked P-47 units. The P-51s stayed on escort duty and fighter sweeps. The missions where they could stay high, the missions where ground fire was less of a threat. It was not an official policy, it was just practical. Use the aircraft that could survive the mission. In early June, Lieutenant William Davis flew a strafing mission over France. Davis was part of the 354th Fighter Group, one of the first units to receive P-51s. He had 21 missions and 4 kills. On June 8, 1944, Davis's flight attacked a German convoy near Caen. 6 trucks, 3 staff cars, 2 motorcycles. They came in from the west at 2,000 feet, rolled into their attack, and opened fire. Davis's rounds hit the lead truck. It exploded. The convoy scattered. Davis pulled up, turned to make another pass. He felt the hit. A sharp crack under the right side of the cockpit. Temperature gauge climbed immediately. 90 degrees, 95, 100. Davis called it out. Coolant hit. He leveled off, headed west toward the coast. The vapor trail started 30 seconds later. Thick white glycol mist pouring from the belly scoop. Temperature at 105 degrees. Davis reduced power to minimum. Temperature held at 105. He was 90 miles from his base at Lashendon, 20 minutes at current speed. Temperature climbed to 108 degrees. Davis opened the radiator flap manually using the emergency handle. Temperature dropped back to 106. He was 60 miles from base, 15 minutes. Temperature climbed to 110 degrees. Maximum permissible. Davis held power steady, 50 miles. From base, 12 minutes. Temperature at 112 degrees. Davis could hear the engine running rough, a vibration through the stick. 40 miles, 10 minutes. Temperature at 114. 30 miles, 8 minutes. Temperature at 116. The engine was hammering now, loud enough to hear over the wind. 20 miles, 6 minutes. Temperature gauge pegged at 118 degrees. Davis could see the airfield ahead. 15 miles, 5 minutes. Engine temperature past maximum. Cylinder heads were failing. 10 miles, 4 minutes. The propeller started windmilling. Engine seized, sudden silence. Davis set up for best glide, 140 miles per hour. Enough altitude, enough distance. He could make it. 8 miles. 3 minutes gliding. Davis crossed the airfield boundary at 300 feet. Dropped the gear. Landed long, halfway down the runway. Rolled to a stop. He shut down the electrical system and climbed out. His hands were shaking. Steam poured from the cowling. He had made it. But he had been 13 minutes from dying because a rifle round had punctured a coolant line. Mitchell inspected Davis's aircraft the next morning. The bullet had entered through the belly skin just ahead of the radiator intake. Small caliber, probably 7.9, 2mm, German rifle round. It had passed through the aluminum skin, through the fuselage structure, and clipped the coolant return line. Not a direct hit, a grazing impact, just enough to open a hole the size of a grain of rice. Enough to drain the system in 13 minutes. The engine was destroyed, 2 cylinder heads cracked, 3 valve seats separated, all 12 pistons scored from running without proper cooling. The Merlin was scrap. Davis had saved the airframe, but the engine could not be saved. But that did not stop the losses. Between April and August 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 569 P-51s. 41% were lost during strafing attacks. Most of those losses were from cooling system damage. The numbers were clear, the vulnerability was real, and nothing was being done to fix it. Then, in late July 1944, a North American aviation engineer named Edgar Schmood visited Debden. Schmood was the lead designer of the P-51. He had designed the airframe, the wing, the cooling system. He was there to inspect combat damage and talk to pilots about aircraft performance. Mitchell met Schmood on the hardstand where 3 damaged P-51s sat waiting for repair. All 3 had cooling system damage. All 3 had been hit by ground fire. All 3 had nearly killed their pilots. Mitchell showed Schmood the damage, showed him the punctured coolant lines, showed him the cracked header tanks, showed him the riddled radiators. Mitchell explained what he had seen over the past 4 months. 14 pilots lost from his squadron alone, most from cooling system failures, single hits that had doomed the aircraft. Schmood listened. He inspected the damage. He asked questions about the combat reports, about the altitudes, about the types of ground fire. Then he said something that surprised Mitchell. Schmood said he knew about the vulnerability. He had always known. It was a design compromise. The cooling system had to be light. It had to be efficient. It had to fit in the airframe without excessive drag. That meant thin aluminum tubing. That meant an exposed radiator. That meant no armor. If they had tried to protect the cooling system, the aircraft would have been heavier, slower, less maneuverable. It would not have had the range to escort bombers to Berlin. It would not have been the P-51. Schmood said the assumption had been that P-51 pilots would stay at altitude, that they would avoid ground fire, that the speed and range would matter more than armor. But combat had not followed the assumptions. Pilots were going low, they were strafing, they were exposed to ground fire, and the cooling system was killing them. Mitchell asked if there was anything that could be done. Schmood said not in the field. The cooling system could not be redesigned without a complete re-engineering effort. That would take months. By the time a new design was ready, the war might be over. Mitchell asked what pilots should do. Schmood said they should avoid ground attack missions when possible. They should stay high. They should minimize exposure to small arms fire. Mitchell said that was not a solution. That was a restriction. That was telling pilots they could not do their jobs because the aircraft could not protect them. Schmood did not have an answer to that. He left Debden the next day. Mitchell never saw him again. But Schmood must have filed a report because 3 weeks later, a technical bulletin came through from Wright Field. The bulletin acknowledged the cooling system vulnerability. It provided guidance on inspecting coolant lines for combat damage. It recommended double clamping all connections. It suggested that pilots reduce power immediately after any suspected cooling system hit to maximize the time before engine seizure. The bulletin did not offer a solution. It just acknowledged the problem and told pilots to be careful. Rodriguez read the bulletin and threw it in the trash. Mitchell read it and filed it with the rest of the maintenance manuals he never looked at. The problem was not a lack of knowledge. The problem was that the aircraft had a fatal vulnerability that could not be fixed. By September 1944, The air war over Europe had shifted. The Luftwaffe was broken. German fighters were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Allied bombers roamed over Germany with relative freedom. P-51 pilots racked up enormous kill scores, not just in air-to-air combat but in strafing attacks on German airfields. In September alone, P-51 pilots destroyed over 400 German aircraft on the ground. But those victories came at a cost. The 8th Air Force lost 78 P-51s in September. 51 of them were lost during strafing attacks. 51 pilots dead or missing because they had gone low and taken fire that punctured their cooling systems. The math was brutal but clear. P-51 pilots could dominate the sky in air-to-air combat. But when they went low, when they attacked ground targets, they were vulnerable in a way that could not be overcome by skill or tactics or courage. One bullet could doom them. Lieutenant Robert Hayes flew 43 more missions after his emergency landing in May. He destroyed 9 more German aircraft, 6 in the air and 3 on the ground. On November 3, 1944, Hayes was part of a strafing attack on a rail yard near Kassel. He made 2 passes, destroying a locomotive and damaging several freight cars. On his 3rd pass, ground fire hit his aircraft. Hayes called it out immediately. Coolant hit. Temperature rising. He climbed to altitude and pointed toward England. This time he did not make it. The engine seized over Holland at 11,000 feet. Hayes bailed out. He landed in a field near Arnhem. British troops found him 2 hours later. He had broken his ankle in the landing, but was otherwise uninjured. Hayes was evacuated to England. He never flew combat again. His P-51 was found 3 months later by advancing Allied troops. It had gone in nose first at 400 miles per hour. The cooling system was completely dry. Mitchell worked at Debden until the war ended in May 1945. He maintained P-51s until the last mission. He checked coolant levels. He pressure-tested header tanks. He double-clamped every connection. He did everything he could to keep the cooling systems working, but he could not make them bulletproof. In the European theatre, the 8th, 9th and 15th Air Forces lost 2,520 P-51s in combat. 41% of those losses in the 8th Air Force were from strafing missions. Most involved cooling system failures. The exact number of pilots killed specifically by cooling system damage is not recorded. But Mitchell kept his own count. In his squadron alone, 19 pilots died or went missing after taking hits to their cooling systems. 19 pilots who might have made it home if the aircraft had been able to survive a single bullet hole. The P-51 Mustang was the finest escort fighter of the war. It had the range to take bombers to Berlin and back. It had the speed to catch anything the Luftwaffe could put in the air. It had the maneuverability to win dogfights against Germany's best pilots. But it had a liquid-cooled engine that could be killed by a single round of small arms fire. And that vulnerability killed hundreds of Allied pilots. After the war, Mitchell returned to Los Angeles. He opened a garage in 1940, ate and worked on cars for 40 years. He never talked much about the P-51s. When people asked, he said he was a mechanic, worked on aircraft, that was all. Hayes returned to Iowa after the war. He married his high school sweetheart, had 3 children, and worked as a commercial pilot for 37 years. He never forgot about Parker. Every April 21st, he thought about the kid who had disappeared over Germany with his engine temperature climbing and no way to stop it. Rodriguez stayed in the Air Force until 1963. He became a master sergeant and trained jet engine mechanics. He told every young crew chief the same story. The story of the P-51 and its cooling system. The story of how a great aircraft could have a fatal flaw. The story of how 19 pilots from one squadron died because of one vulnerable system. In 1991, a military aviation historian researching P-51 combat losses found references to the cooling system, vulnerability in maintenance logs and combat reports from England. The historian tracked down Mitchell through veteran registries. Mitchell was 74 years old by then, still working part-time in his garage. The historian asked him about the cooling system failures. Mitchell confirmed what the records showed. The P-51 was vulnerable. Every mechanic knew it. Every pilot knew it. Nothing could be done about it. The historian estimated that cooling system failures after battle damage accounted for approximately 500 to 600 P-51 losses during the war. Most of those pilots died or became prisoners of war. If the P-51 had been designed with a redundant cooling system, or with protected coolant lines, or with an air-cooled engine, many of those pilots might have survived. But that would not have been a P-51. It would have been a different aircraft. Heavier, slower, less capable. The P-51 was what it was because of the choices that made it great and the choices that made it vulnerable. You could not have one without the other. Robert Mitchell died in 2007 at age 90. He was buried in Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Los Angeles. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II as an aircraft mechanic. It did not mention the 19 pilots he had watched die. It did not mention the coolant systems he had checked every day. It did not mention that he had done everything possible to keep those systems working, knowing they could still be killed by a single bullet. His garage in Los Angeles is still there, though it has a different owner now. On the wall in the back office, there is a faded photograph of a young mechanic in coveralls, standing next to a P-51 Mustang. The date written on the back is April 1944, England. That is how vulnerability works in war. Sometimes the greatest weapons have the greatest weaknesses. Sometimes the thing that makes an aircraft brilliant also makes it fragile. The P-51 Mustang could escort bombers to Berlin and back, but one bullet in the cooling system could bring it down, and hundreds of Allied pilots died because of that single point of failure. That is the truth they did not tell you about the P-51 Mustang. It was the best fighter in the sky, and it could be killed by one bullet. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.